This morning I want to talk about empathy and whether it's possible for us to have empathy for some truckers. Some of you are saying no, yes. You see, I knew this was going to be a risky sermon to deliver. I wasn't sure about whether to address it. And the truth is, since the beginning of the pandemic, I haven't really spoken much about policies, even though, like most of you, depending on the day, I'll feel very strongly about a policy not going far enough or a policy going too far. But I learned very early on, when the pandemic's restrictions started being imposed, that how I felt on Monday wasn't necessarily going to be how I felt on Tuesday. I was going to feel all angry on Monday, but then I'd speak to Rabbi Sachs and he'd say, actually it makes sense. And I'd say, okay, you're right, it's true. So I better lay off speaking about policies, COVID restriction policies, from the pulpit, because unfortunately once you deliver a sermon, you can't rewrite it the next day. But this is a big story. Some of you know I got back from Israel a couple of days ago. And on the taxi ride from the airport to Jerusalem, the taxi driver wanted to know where I was coming from. And I said, came from Canada. And the first thing he wanted to know about was the trucker convoy. No one has ever asked me anything about Ottawa in my life when I've traveled internationally. And it's all he wanted to talk about. I was really shocked that as far away as Israel and in many other countries around the world, this story is getting a significant amount of press and significant amount of attention. So, if the Torah is there to respond, to speak about the needs of the day, if it is indeed an eternal source of guidance and teaching, we might want to delve into its lessons, to ask about how we ought to respond, how we ought to think about a movement for freedom, a freedom convoy that seems to be, depending on the day, gaining steam or losing steam. But before I speak about the substance of the message, there are two things that I think ought to be said, maybe some elephants in the room when it comes to this trucker convoy. The first concerns the manifestations of hate and the hateful people that have appended themselves onto this rally. There are, I've seen the pictures, some hateful people and hateful symbols that have appeared. You've all read about it too. Since the beginning of the pandemic, actually, we have seen the usage of Holocaust symbols and language and imagery in the pandemic debates. We can only have one reaction to that. It is unacceptable. It is inappropriate. It ought to be universally condemned. All of us understand the message that using such symbols is trying to convey. But in the end, what it does is belittle the Holocaust and mock the Holocaust and disgrace the memory of the 6 million. And if you ask true victims of the Nazi genocide, they will tell you this is no Holocaust. Lockdowns are not the Holocaust. Police officers are not Nazis. Mask-wearing regulations are not Nuremberg laws. Public health officials are not the Gestapo. Quarantine hotels are not concentration camps. We reject manifestations of hate and racism and anti-Semitism at the freedom rallies. And I hope that all the truckers understand that their message is going to be lost. They'll turn everyone against them unless they condemn universally hate wherever it appears at their rallies. The second elephant that ought to be addressed is the lawlessness that is going on. You talk about trying to destroy your message. Lawlessness will destroy it. Protest is a very healthy part of a democracy. We should be proud to live in a country where people can express their opinions, including criticizing the government, whether you agree with their message or not. But protests also have the tendency to get out of hand. Protests are fueled by anger often, and anger is not an easy emotion to manage. The blockading of roads, bridges, borders, and highways is against the law, plain and simple. If I tried to do it, or you tried to do it, we'd be arrested on the spot. I don't know why it's taking so long for the government, for law and order, to come in and say, you have to stop with the chaos and stop with the lawlessness. I'm glad I'm seeing now stories that the Premier and the Prime Minister are starting to take this seriously, but it's strange that it has taken so long. We reject the manifestations of hate. We reject the manifestations of chaos and lawlessness. We call on our authorities to keep law and order in our country swiftly. So, having addressed the hate and the lawlessness, let's also recognize that most large protests attract certain extreme elements. And it's really not fair to dismiss an entire movement or message because of its extremists. Every single protest movement has extremist elements, from civil rights to Black Lives Matter, even the movement to free Soviet Jewry. It is possible to understand and appreciate the message at the core of a protest, while at the same time denouncing some of its tactics. There are thousands of protesters involved in the Freedom Convoy. The vast majority are not insurrectionists or white supremacists or racists or misogynists. They have the right to protest peacefully, the right to say what they have to say, and I think they also have the right to be heard. Again, leaving the lawlessness and the hatefulness aside, I am meeting more and more people every day who feel the same way the truckers do about the unprecedented government intrusion into our private lives that is continuing today, and the increasing evidence that such intrusion is not reasonably justified. These friends of mine and other acquaintances tend not to speak. They don't tell their opinions so easily to strangers because they're afraid of being labeled. But they do talk to people they trust privately. They won't attend the protests, but some are very happy that finally people are starting to push back. The fact that they have to whisper their feelings to me is a sad commentary on the state of modern Canadian political life. In this country, our politics has swollen into a kind of moral marker or an identity tag. What was once simply a disagreement or an argument over an issue has taken on for too many people the character of a morality test. If you sign on here and believe these things, you're good. But if you sign there and don't believe these things, you're bad. Anti-vaxxer, racist, Neanderthal. It is the back and forth, the arguments, the disagreements, the conversations that have been sorely missing from Canadian pandemic discourse. Canada has had some of the strongest COVID restrictions in the world, and very little debate, real debate, and exploration of the costs of these restrictions, and in particular, how those costs distribute themselves unequally among different segments of society. We all know that the costs of this pandemic, the cost of the pandemic restrictions, has been immense. They remain immense. I just traveled to Israel and could rant about how difficult it is to travel all day. But that's the silly stuff. The real costs are the setbacks in learning for our children, the economic and financial consequences for individuals and businesses and governments across the country, and the fentanyl overdoses, and the suicides, and the crime, and the despair. And all of these costs fall disproportionately on the poor and the marginalized. Were all of these costs considered carefully? Were all taken seriously by policymakers? Canada guarantees freedom of religion. It is the first freedom listed in our charter. But I remain still today amazed at the quiet submissiveness of our reactions, even as this fundamental freedom was taken away from us overnight. And the same with so many other civil rights and charter rights, which continue to be trampled upon. The silent obedience could not go on forever, particularly when more and more evidence suggests that we're just going to have to learn to live with COVID as part of our daily lives for the long run, and that there are no reasonable policy alternatives to that unfortunate reality. Fundamentally, I'm asking, this seems to be a question of empathy. For some of us, this pandemic has been an inconvenience at best, or maybe even had some benefits. But for others, that's not true. For others whose lives have been ruined by this pandemic, but not the pandemic, by the policy responses to it. The people who have chosen, for one reason or another, not to get vaccinated and can't travel anymore and can't even shop in the same stores that vaccinated people can shop in. Many synagogues won't even allow the unvaccinated in the building, and I'm proud we're not one of them. Can we have empathy for those in precarious economic positions, those who can't work remotely on their laptops, like the staff of hotels and restaurants, small business people, and transportation workers for that matter? Can we have empathy for families who have more than 2 children, or children with special needs, or families who choose not to have internet at home, for whom virtual schooling is a joke? Can we have empathy for the elderly who were cut off from their families during their most difficult days, who will never get that time back, and for the bereaved who were not able to properly say goodbye to their loved ones. We don't have to agree with the truckers or their demands. The question is, can we have empathy? We should be able to have a conversation without labeling or demonization. It is sad that such conversations cannot happen with many of the leaders of this country. Let me ask you all a question about Moshe that maybe you've never asked yourself before. How did Moshe come to self-identify as a Jew? Probably at some point, the Torah doesn't tell us, but we assume that at some point someone told him that he had Jewish origins. But just because somebody is told that they have Jewish ancestry, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to embrace that identity. And they're particularly going to be averse to embracing that identity when they're a prince in Pharaoh's palace, and when you're educated as an Egyptian, and when all of your friends are Egyptians. And even more so when that Jewish part of your identity happens to correlate with a bunch of slaves who are being mistreated in the country that you live in. How did Moses come to the point where he could self-identify as a Jew? The Midrash cites Rabbi Elazar, the son of Rabbi Yossi Haglili. Moshe saw a child bearing an adult's load, and an adult bearing a child's load, and a woman bearing a man's load, and a man bearing a woman's load, and a youth bearing an old man's load, and an old man bearing a youth's load. And he would ignore his princely status and go and ease their burdens and act as if he was helping Pharaoh. God saw this and said, "You ignored your own affairs and went to observe Israel's suffering and treated them like the leader of your brothers. I will ignore the Elyonim and the Tachtonim, the angels above and the angels below, and I will speak to you." Moses came to recognize his connection to the Jewish people through empathy. He saw the suffering of other people, and their suffering became his suffering. And God so admired his empathy, his ability to descend from his high status and empathize with those of low status, that God did the same thing, went down from the heavens and sympathized with our ancestors enslaved in Egypt. This is an incredible midrash, one of my favorites. What I love about it, and what I think a lot of people miss, is that Rabbi Elazar describes Moshe's empathy purposefully extending to many different kinds of people. The young and the old, men and women, big and small. Most of us have a very easy time empathizing with some people, particularly those who are like us, or who agree with us, or who remind us of ourselves. Empathy is always strongest in groups where people identify with each other, like family, or friends, or clubs, even religions or races. But Moses is able to identify with the burdens of different kinds of people, with slaves. And that really is the key, I think, to understanding Moshe's greatness, his uniqueness, and why he becomes the leader to free our ancestors from bondage. There is a lesson here, my friends, for our current circumstances. I think I know my audience pretty well, and I know that the people that I'm speaking to today or who are listening on the live stream probably don't have a lot in common with the truckers of the Freedom Convoy. Geographically, economically, philosophically, professionally, we are different. But when the Mishnah talks about empathy, empathy is called in Hebrew noseh be'ol chaveiro. That's translated as can carry the burden of his fellow. That description is not qualified or restricted by who that fellow is or the type of burden that he or she is carrying. Whether that burden is psychological, emotional, or physical, or whether you think that pain is justified or not. It is a character trait that ought to be universally applied, that we are sorely lacking, that is key to living a moral life, and particularly important for resolving conflicts in democratic countries. When we demonize others and resort to name-calling, all we're doing is inflating a cycle of bullying, failing to address the fundamental issues or make any progress. I call upon all of us, and especially our leaders, to use the quality of empathy to get beyond the morality politics that have come to define our approach towards pandemic policy. Seeing the world through the eyes of another is the first step towards getting them to change, the first step towards making progress. It is not easy, and very few people are able to do it. But as the Midrash teaches, those who are able are also able to get God's attention. Shabbat Shalom.